Picture a negotiating table in the Dutch city of Breda, 1667. Diplomats from England and the Netherlands are hammering out the terms ending a bitter, expensive war fought largely over trade routes and colonial territory. The kind of drawn-out negotiation where exhausted delegates argue over lists of distant possessions most of them will never personally see. Buried among the larger provisions is a much smaller, stranger point of contention, a tiny volcanic island in present-day Indonesia, barely 3 miles long that one side refuses to give up under almost any circumstances. In exchange for keeping it, the Dutch agree to formally hand over a Y-shaped island on the other side of the planet, one most Europeans at the time considered far less valuable. That island was Manhattan. That's not an oversimplified internet legend. It's a real clause in a real treaty, and understanding why it happened requires understanding just how much the world's priorities have shifted since the 17th century. Here's what actually happened. In 1624, the Dutch West India Company established a trading settlement called New Amsterdam on the southern tip of Manhattan, part of a larger colony they called New Netherland. It grew steadily as a modest, remarkably diverse commercial outpost, already known for a level of religious and ethnic tolerance well beyond most English colonies of the same era, largely because the Dutch West India Company cared more about trade than enforcing any particular religious orthodoxy. Records from the period describe as many as 18 different languages being spoken on the streets of a settlement that never grew much larger than a few thousand people, an extraordinary level of diversity for anywhere in the 17th century world, let alone a small colonial outpost. In 1664, during rising tensions between England and the Netherlands, English forces seized the settlement without much of a fight and renamed it New York, after the Duke of York. The war that followed, and the treaty that eventually ended it, forced both sides to decide which territorial gains were worth formally keeping. And this is where nutmeg enters the story. At the time, nutmeg was one of the most valuable commodities on Earth, used as a flavoring, a preservative, and widely believed across Europe to help ward off the plague, whether or not that belief held up to any real scrutiny. The demand was intense enough that nutmeg occasionally sold for more than its weight in gold. And there was exactly one place on the planet where nutmeg trees grew naturally. A small cluster of volcanic islands in present-day EA. Indonesia, called the Banda Islands, the Dutch had spent decades securing a brutal, nearly total monopoly over that nutmeg supply, including a campaign against the indigenous Bandanese population so severe that entire communities were killed or enslaved specifically to eliminate any local competition for control of the trade. Under the command of a Dutch official named John Pieterszoon Cohen, colonial forces in the 1620s killed or deported the overwhelming majority of the Bandanese population, replacing them with enslaved laborers brought in to work the nutmeg groves under strict company control. It remains one of the darker chapters of the entire spice trade era, carried out specifically to guarantee no rival power or independent trader could ever challenge Dutch control of the world's only natural nutmeg supply. One tiny holdout remained after all of that, the island of Run, which had fallen under English claim years earlier. For the Dutch, finally securing undisputed control of Run wasn't a minor diplomatic footnote. It was the last missing piece of a monopoly they'd already paid an enormous human and financial cost to build. So, when the Treaty of Breda was finally signed, the Dutch formally ceded New Netherland, Manhattan included, to England, while England confirmed Dutch control over Run. On paper, in 1667, it looked like the more valuable trade. Nutmeg was a proven, extraordinarily lucrative commodity. A modest trading post on a distant, unremarkable island off the North American coast was, to most European eyes at the time, a far less obvious prize. So that's what happened. Now otherwise, picture that same negotiating table, except this time, Dutch diplomats decide Manhattan isn't worth surrendering. Maybe they judge the harbor's long-term commercial potential more accurately than their actual counterparts did. Maybe internal politics back home simply favor holding on to existing American territory over finalizing a nutmeg monopoly that, honestly, could plausibly be secured some other way regardless. The most immediate consequence reshapes the entire map of colonial North America. New Netherland, still Dutch, sits geographically wedged directly between the New England colonies to the north and the Chesapeake and Southern English colonies to the south. In our actual history, English colonization formed one largely contiguous strip of territory along the Atlantic coast, from Massachusetts down through the Carolinas. A continuous run of shared language, shared legal tradition, and eventually shared political grievances that made a unified colonial identity, and eventually a unified revolution, at least geographically plausible. A persistent Dutch colony sitting in the middle of that strip breaks the continuity entirely, forcing English colonies to interact with, trade around, or eventually confront a foreign European power sitting directly in the middle of what would otherwise be their own contiguous territory. That fracture matters enormously for what comes over a century later. The American Revolution depended not just on shared grievances against a distant crown, but on colonies that were geographically connected enough to coordinate, communicate, and eventually fight together as something resembling a unified front. Postal routes, militia coordination, and the physical movement of delegates to meetings like the Continental Congress all depended on relatively easy overland travel between colonies that, in our actual history, shared a language, a legal system, and a colonial administrative structure. Historians studying this exact scenario point out that a foreign Dutch colony sitting between New England and the southern colonies could have meaningfully complicated, delayed, or even prevented the specific kind of unified colonial identity that made a single, coordinated revolution possible in the way it actually happened. Instead of one new nation eventually forming along that coastline, this otherwise history might produce 2 or 3 separate nations, each shaped by whichever colonial power actually controlled its specific stretch of coast. Manhattan itself develops along a noticeably different cultural line, too. Dutch New Amsterdam was already, in our actual history, a strikingly multicultural, trade-obsessed settlement, home to a wide mix of religions and nationalities decades before that kind of diversity became common anywhere else in colonial North America. A Manhattan that stays Dutch for another century or more likely keeps that commercial, tolerant character as its foundation, rather than adopting it gradually the way the actual English-controlled New York eventually did. Even in our actual history, traces of that Dutch foundation survive everywhere if you know where to look. Harlem takes its name from the Dutch city of Haarlem. Brooklyn comes from the Dutch Breukelen, and Wall Street itself is named for a defensive wall the Dutch built along what was then the settlement's northern boundary. In an otherwise history where Dutch control simply continues, those aren't just etymological footnotes anymore. They're the living, dominant culture of an entire major world city. Dutch place names, Dutch legal traditions, and quite possibly the Dutch language itself could remain dominant in the region for considerably longer, and there's a real chance the city we know today might still be called some version of New Amsterdam rather than New York at all. It's worth being honest, though, that Manhattan's specific geographic advantages, a deep, naturally sheltered harbor sitting at the mouth of a major river system, make it an extraordinarily valuable piece of territory regardless of which flag happens to be flying over it. Even in this otherwise scenario, a Dutch-controlled Manhattan likely still grows into a major commercial port eventually, simply because the harbor itself doesn't care which European nation claims it. The bigger, more consequential difference isn't whether Manhattan becomes an important city. It almost certainly still does. But which language, which legal system, and which broader colonial map it grows up inside of. Meanwhile, back on the nutmeg side of the ledger, the difference is far less dramatic. Dutch control over the global nutmeg monopoly likely gets resolved one way or another regardless of what happens with Manhattan. Given how much military and financial investment the Dutch had already sunk into securing it, Run Island's fate probably ends up in Dutch hands either way, through some other diplomatic arrangement or continued military pressure, meaning the nutmeg side of this story likely plays out almost identically, no matter which choice gets made at that. negotiating table in Breda. So maybe the strangest part of this whole otherwise scenario isn't the fractured colonial map or the different language spoken on a Manhattan street corner today. It's the fact that two 17th century diplomats weighing nutmeg against an unremarkable trading post were making a decision about relative value that looks almost comically backward from where we're standing now and had no possible way of knowing that the lesser prize would eventually become one of the most valuable pieces of real estate on the entire planet. A single acre of land on that same island today is worth more than the entire 17th century nutmeg trade likely earned across its most profitable decade combined. Nobody sitting at that table in Breda could have imagined that outcome, because nothing in their economic experience gave them any reason to. Spices were tangible, immediately valuable, and instantly convertible into wealth back home. A distant trading post's long-term potential as a global financial center was a category of value that simply didn't exist. Yet, as a concept, anyone could reasonably weigh against a fistful of nutmeg. If the fate of an entire future global city could hinge on which side of a spice versus real estate trade, two exhausted diplomats happen to land on, it raises a pointed question worth carrying forward. How many other places we now consider obviously permanently valuable were once dismissed as the consolation prize in someone else's much bigger deal? That's exactly where we're headed next time on Otherwise, into the places history almost gave away for something else entirely. Subscribe and find out what almost got traded next.